The Shadows of Fukushima. Masato Nakamura was not a man prone to fear. He was methodical and scientific, more comfortable with numbers and facts than with the unpredictable ebb and flow of human emotion. But as he stared at the suitcase in his small Tokyo apartment, he felt an unmistakable chill creep down his spine. The suitcase, a sturdy black number with enough room for a week's worth of clothes, was supposed to be his companion for an adventure, not the harbinger of dread. He was about to journey to Fukushima, a place that had been a source of ominous headlines and heart-wrenching stories since the nuclear disaster over a decade ago. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Dr. Keiko Fujimoto, a renowned nuclear physicist and his mentor at the university. Remember, Masato, fear is not your enemy. It's a sign that you're about to do something brave. See you at the station. With a deep breath, Masato zipped up his suitcase and stepped out into the crisp morning air. Tokyo's hustle and bustle, usually comforting, seemed strangely alien today. The familiarity of the busy streets and towering skyscrapers did nothing to diminish his growing apprehension. He arrived at the train station earlier than necessary, more out of a desire to escape his empty apartment than any real concern about punctuality. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Fujimoto. She was a diminutive woman, but her presence filled the room, her face an unreadable mask of resolve. "We have a long journey ahead, Masato," she said, her voice steady and reassuring. "Let's make it count." The train ride to Fukushima was uneventful. They traveled in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The comfortable, air-conditioned compartment of the train contrasted sharply with the grim reality that awaited them. Masato watched the cityscapes give way to lush countryside, the beauty of the landscape a harsh reminder of the invisible threat that lurked in Fukushima: radiation. Upon arriving in Fukushima, the sense of desolation was immediate. The once bustling streets were now deserted, a ghost town frozen in time. The buildings, though standing, bore the scars of the disaster, a silent testament to the havoc wrought by the nuclear meltdown. Masato and Dr. Fujimoto checked into their temporary accommodations, a sparsely furnished but functional guest house run by an elderly couple. As he settled into the cold, hard bed, Masato felt a creeping sense of unease. He couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched, of 1,000 invisible eyes scrutinizing his every move. But the logical part of his brain dismissed it as nerves, the product of his overactive imagination. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow the real work begins. He drifted off to sleep, unaware of the shadowy figure lurking outside his window, its inscrutable gaze fixed on the sleeping scientist. On the first morning in Fukushima, Masato awoke to an eerie silence. The hustle and bustle of Tokyo seemed worlds away. Dr. Fujimoto had already started her day, a steaming cup of coffee in her hand, and a stack of documents sprawled out on the small dining table. They spent their day visiting various sites in the exclusion zone, taking readings and samples. The Geiger counter clicked incessantly, a harsh reminder of the invisible foe they were up against. As they ventured further into the zone, Masato couldn't shake off the uncanny feeling he had experienced the night before. He felt eyes on him, an unsettling presence that seemed to trail them wherever they went. He attributed it to the eerie quiet and the abandoned surroundings, but the sensation persisted. By the afternoon, they had ventured deep into the exclusion zone. The abandoned buildings were overgrown with vegetation, nature slowly reclaiming the area. As they walked through a deserted street, Masato noticed something odd. One of the houses on the side of the street, despite being abandoned for years, looked less dilapidated than the rest. The windows were intact, and the front door, though weathered, stood strong. "Dr. Fujimoto!" he called out, pointing to the house. "That doesn't look abandoned, does it?" Intrigued, they approached the house cautiously. The air around it seemed colder, heavier somehow. As they stepped inside, the eerie feeling of being watched intensified. The house was surprisingly well preserved. There was dust, but not as much as they'd expected, and the furniture seemed relatively untouched. Suddenly, a cold breeze whipped through the house, causing the papers on a nearby table to flutter. The temperature seemed to plummet, their breaths misting in the cold air. The chill was unnatural, making Masato shiver despite the warm summer day outside. The Geiger counter in Masato's hand stuttered, then fell silent. He looked at it in confusion, tapping the device as if to jumpstart it. And then, in the deafening silence, they heard it. A soft, hollow laughter echoing through the empty house. It was unearthly, chilling them to their cores. As quickly as it had come, the sound disappeared, leaving them in silence once again. The feeling of being watched had intensified to a point where it was almost palpable. Dr. Fujimoto turned to Masato, her face pale but her eyes steady. "Let's get out of here," she said, her voice steady. As they hurriedly left the house, Masato couldn't help but look back. The house loomed ominously behind them, its windows appearing like dark, hollow eyes watching their retreat. That night, back at the guest house, sleep was a distant memory. The eerie encounter at the house had shaken them, and Masato lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind abuzz with questions. Was the house haunted? Or was there a more scientific explanation? And most importantly, what did this mean for their mission? As he eventually drifted off to sleep, he could have sworn he heard the faint sound of laughter carried on the wind. Little did he know, this was just the beginning. The days that followed were filled with unease. The encounter at the house seemed to have opened a door to something inexplicable. The feeling of being watched persisted, growing stronger each day. Strange occurrences became commonplace. They would find objects moved, hear whispers in the wind, and see shadows where there should have been none. Masato, being a man of science, struggled to make sense of these happenings. He turned to the only tool he knew, empirical evidence and rational deduction. But every attempt to record or measure these strange occurrences yielded no concrete results. The Geiger counter would often glitch in these moments, as if reacting to something beyond its design. In the midst of all this, the research was falling behind. The uncanny incidents were affecting their work and their resolve. The days turned into a blur of fieldwork, marred by unsettling events. One day, Masato was alone in one of the abandoned factories they were surveying. He was taking readings, trying to keep his focus on his work, when he heard a noise from the other end of the factory. A sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. A chill ran down his spine as he turned around to face the source of the sound. A large piece of machinery, previously stationed at the other end of the factory, had moved several feet closer. He looked around, his heart pounding, but found no one. A sense of dread settled over him, a feeling of not being alone in the factory. The shadows around him seemed to dance, closing in on him. Suddenly his Geiger counter sprung to life, beeping rapidly. The readings were off the charts, not possible under normal circumstances. The machinery, the shadows, the whispers, everything seemed to converge into a frightening realization. Fukushima was not just a place of nuclear disaster. It was haunted by something more potent, more terrifying than radiation. But what was it? And how did it relate to their mission? The tangled web of shadows around them seemed to tighten, obscuring the path ahead. The next day, Masato and Dr. Fujimoto decided to visit the local library. They needed to learn more about the area, its history, and its people. Perhaps there were clues in the past that could explain the uncanny occurrences they were experiencing. The library, surprisingly, was still functional, run by an old man who refused to leave his hometown despite the disaster. His name was Toshio, and he had lived in Fukushima all his life. His sunken eyes lit up at their interest in the town's history, and he gladly helped them find the information they needed. As they delved into the past, they discovered something startling. The area where they had found the eerily preserved house and the factory had a history of strange occurrences, dating back to before the nuclear disaster. Residents had reported feeling watched, hearing strange noises, and seeing shadows moving in their peripheral vision. The incidents had escalated over the years, culminating in a series of unexplained disappearances in the year leading up to the disaster. After the nuclear meltdown, the entire area was abandoned, and the incidents were largely forgotten. But now it seemed the past was resurfacing. As they dug deeper, they found references to an old legend about a powerful entity known as the Shadow Keeper. According to the legend, the Shadow Keeper was a vengeful spirit that could manipulate shadows and feed on fear. For Masato, it was a lot to take in. He had always been a man of science, dismissing such stories as superstitions. But the uncanny incidents they had experienced were hard to ignore. They left the library with more questions than answers. As the sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows around them, Masato couldn't shake off the feeling that they were delving into something far beyond their comprehension. The secrets of the past seemed to echo in the chilling wind, intertwining with their own fears and uncertainties. The journey into the shadows of Fukushima had only just begun. Subscribe to get more thrilling stories. In the days that followed, Masato and Dr. Fujimoto continued to grapple with their experiences. The fear of the unknown, combined with the daunting task of their radiation study, began to weigh heavily on them. They explored the exclusion zone further, and with each step, they seemed to sink deeper into a world where logic and rationality seemed increasingly distant. One particular day, they decided to visit the heart of the disaster, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. As the imposing structure loomed in front of them, the Geiger counter crackled intensely, a morbid reminder of the power that had been unleashed here years ago. As they walked the deserted grounds, the atmosphere was heavy with the echoes of the past. The silence was deafening, punctuated only by the ominous click of the Geiger counter and their footsteps on the concrete. They found themselves whispering, as if afraid to disturb the ghosts of the past. The shadows grew longer as the day wore on, and with them came an uncanny feeling. Masato couldn't shake the sensation that they were being watched, a feeling that had become all too familiar. The shadowy figure from their first night in Fukushima seemed to lurk in every corner, watching them with unseen eyes. In the deepest bowels of the ruined reactor building, where the shadows were darkest, they found something out of place. An old, worn-out doll sat on a rusted metal console. Its glass eyes stared blankly at them, adding an eerie contrast to the industrial surroundings. As Masato reached out to pick up the doll, he felt a cold gust of wind. The temperature around them dropped suddenly, and the Geiger counter fell silent. Then, from the silence, they heard it, a child's giggle echoing in the deserted reactor. The laughter sent chills down their spines. It was a sound that had no place in this desolate monument of nuclear disaster. The laughter echoed off the concrete walls, growing louder, as if the child was getting closer. The echoes of desolation had taken on a new, more frightening form. The fallout of the disaster was no longer just physical. It was increasingly spectral, hinting at a terrifying nexus of science and the supernatural. Over the next few days, the line between the physical and the supernatural seemed to blur even further. The strange occurrences intensified. The sense of being watched never left them, and they could almost hear whispers in the wind. The whispers were unintelligible at first, just faint sounds carried on the wind, but slowly they began to take shape, forming words and sentences. The voices seemed to be calling out to them, their tones urgent, pleading. One night, as Masato lay in bed, the whispers became clear. He could hear a woman's voice, soft yet insistent. "Help us," she pleaded. "Free us from the shadows." It was an eerie request, one that filled Masato with a deep sense of dread. But alongside the fear, there was also a newfound determination. The voices, the Shadow Keeper, the hauntings, they were all somehow connected to the disaster. And as a scientist, it was his duty to uncover the truth, however terrifying it might be. With renewed resolve, Masato and Dr. Fujimoto delved deeper into the research. They studied the local legends, the history of the haunted locations, and the timelines of the strange occurrences. They realized that the intensity and frequency of the hauntings were correlated with the levels of radiation in the area. It was as if the nuclear disaster had somehow awakened or amplified the Shadow Keeper. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, they realized that they were dealing with a force that straddled the line between science and the supernatural. The task was daunting, but they knew they couldn't turn back now. The voices of Fukushima were counting on them. Armed with their newfound understanding, Masato and Dr. Fujimoto decided to confront the Shadow Keeper. According to the legends, the entity could be appeased and controlled with a specific ritual. It was a long shot, but it was the only plan they had. Under the cover of night, they returned to the heart of the exclusion zone. The moon bathed the desolate landscape in an eerie glow, casting long shadows that seemed to dance in anticipation. The air was heavy with the anticipation of the confrontation to come. At the center of the zone, they began the ritual. It felt strange to Masato, conducting a centuries-old ritual in the middle of a modern nuclear disaster site. But the contrast between the old and the new, the physical and the supernatural, seemed to capture the essence of their journey. As they recited the incantations, the whispers grew louder. The shadows around them seemed to twist and turn, coalescing into a dark, inscrutable figure. The Shadow Keeper had arrived. Despite the fear coursing through his veins, Masato stepped forward. He spoke directly to the entity, his voice echoing in the silence of the night. He asked the Shadow Keeper to release the souls trapped in its shadows and return to its slumber. For a moment there was silence. Then the figure began to shift, shadows detaching and floating away like dark wisps of smoke. The whispers grew quieter. The feeling of being watched started to fade, and the oppressive heaviness in the air lifted. With bated breath, Masato and Dr. Fujimoto watched as the Shadow Keeper disappeared, plunging them into the ordinary darkness of the night. It felt as if they had awoken from a strange, chilling dream, stepping back into the world of logic and science. The following days were quiet. The strange occurrences ceased, and their work resumed without any interference. But the memory of their encounter with the Shadow Keeper remained fresh, a haunting reminder of the journey they had undertaken. In the weeks that followed, Masato and Dr. Fujimoto finalized their radiation study. Their findings were groundbreaking, shedding light on the lasting impact of the nuclear disaster. But alongside the scientific report, they carried with them a story, one that blurred the lines between science and the supernatural. Upon their return to Tokyo, they found themselves transformed. They had ventured into the shadows of Fukushima and had emerged with a newfound respect for the power of the unseen. They had gained knowledge, but they had also paid a price. The eerie encounters had left their mark, a chilling reminder of the abyss they had stared into. Back in their world of academia and research, they often found themselves lost in thought, the haunting memories of Fukushima never far from their minds. The experience had broadened their perspective, teaching them that there were things in this world that could not be explained by science alone. In the end, the journey had been more than just a scientific expedition. It had been a dive into the unknown, a confrontation with their fears, and an exploration of the thin line between science and the supernatural. As they walked the bustling streets of Tokyo, amidst the towering skyscrapers and the thrumming energy of the city, they carried with them the shadows of Fukushima, a haunting memory, a terrifying adventure, and a chilling story that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Hey there, thanks for tuning into our story. We'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Don't miss out on any future tales. Hit that subscribe button and stay in the loop. And remember, kindly share your feedback. Cheers!